Yeah.
Traditionally, you would not include that many photographs in a cookbook, but because we created all of this content in-house, we were able to really pay a lot of attention to it. And we worked on our own time in a sense. We didn't have to hire out. There's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of, budgeting that goes into writing a cookbook if you don't shoot your own photographs and you
Hmm.
hire a photographer. And it's always good to realize that it's not just the recipes, it's not just the writing of the book, and it's not just the photographs, it's the combination of everything coming together and prioritizing what you do well and enjoy and what perhaps you can farm out and let someone else show their skills. And we here at my business, we just happen to like doing all of it. So we did.
This is your host, Dyutama, but you can call me DJ. And I love to inspire food photographers to dream. I spent 15 years as an architect studying buildings and constructing hospitals before taking the biggest leap of faith of my life, which was setting up a food styling and food photography business right from scratch. If you're a dreamer like me, wanting to start a new photography business or grow your existing food photography business, jump right into a world where I share practical, actionable strategies to improve your photography skills, to work with clients, make more money, all with a fearless mindset. This is the My Food Lens podcast, and we take you one step closer to your dreams. So let's go. Welcome to another episode of the My Food Lens podcast. Now, we as food content creators or as creatives who love food, many of us actually nurture the dream of writing a cookbook one day. We have family recipes, we have our grandmother's recipes. Sometimes we are passionate about creating new flavors ourselves, or our cookbooks are actually our medium of showcasing our photography. All right. So there are so many reasons why many of us actually nurture the dream of writing a cookbook, but also there are so many reasons why many of us get derailed and demotivated to actually pursue that dream. And that is because the process of writing a cookbook is somewhat mystical. We don't always know what's involved and who's involved and how much money does it take and what does it actually take to produce a cookbook. Do we do it all ourselves? Do we take someone's help? Who photographs it? Who approves it? How does it print? How do we go and put it out in the market? Who buys it? Right? What do we put in our contract? Who is overseeing our creative freedom when we put down these negotiations and creative contracts in place? There is so much that needs to be thought about and put into place and considered. And this cookbook writing process is elaborate, but it does not have to be overwhelming. It does not have to create burnout, and it does not have to be daunting. And who else better than our guest today to tell us all about that? Our guest today is Jessie Sierra Ross, and you might find her name familiar because Jessie was on this podcast a few years ago, and she was talking to us all about how to show up on TV with your food content. Now, Jessie is a food and lifestyle blogger. She makes regular appearances on TV channels like NBC, CBS, Bloom TV Network, and many others. And Jessie has just written her first cookbook. It's a book about cooking and home entertaining. And Jessie has gone through the whole process herself. She's done the writing herself. She's done the photography with her husband, her business partner. And she's going to walk us step by step through everything, right from pitching, proposal, to photography, to manuscripts, to getting an editor, to getting a designer, to having the publisher, batching, no batching, and also marketing. Once you have the book, what do you do with it? How do you really make it reach the people that you created it for? She is going to walk us through the entire process of how to write and photograph a cookbook without feeling overwhelmed or burning out. All right. So with that, let's welcome Jessie. Hi, Jessie, and welcome to the My Food Lens podcast. What an absolute delight to have you back here You were here, I think, about 2 years ago, and you shared everything about being on TV, which was absolutely spectacular. So I can't wait for our chat today because I think it'll be nothing short of that. Welcome, Jessie.
Oh my goodness, with an intro like that, I am so tickled to be back here. And I have to say, it's such a pleasure to chat with you. And I can't believe that it's been 2 years already. And we've both learned and grown so much in this food content arena.
I know. It's as if sometimes time is slow and sometimes time is really, really fast. And look at you. The last time I spoke to you, you were on TV, you're still on TV, and now you're writing a cookbook, something that a lot of food bloggers, food photographers, they kind of dream of. And everyone kind of, nurtures this little hope and dream that, oh, maybe I can convert my grandmother's recipes into a book, or, I have these beautiful ideas or these visions. And I wish I could write a book one day, and look at you doing it in real. So I'm excited to chat about this. I would love our audience to hear. I know it's your first cookbook, so I'm sure it was not easy at all. And I'm sure that, you were overwhelmed and maybe there was some, frustrations, maybe there were roadblocks, curveballs. I'm sure it has taken a lot of blood, sweat, and hard work to get it there. And I think our audience would really appreciate understanding what it takes for someone to write a cookbook for the first time, especially. So let's start right at the top. Jessie, tell us, why do you think like creatives should even think of writing a cookbook? What would it bring? What would be some of the advantages?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. First, we start with a dream. Many of us, because we are in this creative field, particularly in food, we want to reach people. Food is all about giving and having that conversation and nurturing. So writing a cookbook felt very natural. And I think for many of us, it's the next step, whether we are a food photographer, a blogger, or someone who just sort of dabbles in the writing and conversation of food. I have a dear friend of mine in my area. She's a cookbook agent. And she once said to me when I was starting to dive into this dream, which I've had for 10 years, it's taken 10 years to sort of come to this point, and it took about a year to have my fourth child, this cookbook. But she said to me one time, "You're not going to write a cookbook to make a fortune. That's not why we do this. But it becomes a calling card. It becomes the most perfect business card ever. Because what happens is you get a lot more credibility if you are published. You can have a blog, you can be on TV, you can have, a great portfolio, but to say, my name is Jessie Sierra Ross and I am the author of Seasons Around the Table, that becomes something that pushes a lot of momentum your way and opens a lot of doors. So from that basis, I think if you have an interest in writing that cookbook, go for it. Look into it because it can really help boost your career, but also creatively. This has been something that has really fed my soul. It has kept me up at night. It has made me laugh. It has made me cry. I've certainly eaten well during this, while doing recipe testing and shooting, but it becomes a piece in your puzzle and another stepping stone in your food focused career.
I love that answer. I just love it because I think there are so many things that we need to do in our creative journeys that are fulfilling, that have high value and more than monetary value. And sometimes that value is much higher. So I just absolutely love. In fact, one of the questions I was going to ask you is like, did you monetize in any way? How financially lucrative was this cookbook? I was going to ask you that. So did you monetize in any way, or, how did that work out?
Also, I went with traditional publishing. So I was approached by a publisher with a spark of an idea, and we negotiated and we went back and forth and created the book that I had envisioned. So there is, there's finances in it. Yes, it will be making money. If you were to self-publish, that's a different sort of format. You can certainly monetize that, or you can give it away as a freebie if you wanted to do a smaller cookbook, say 20 recipes, to help boost your profile, either with your email list, your potential clients. All of these different facets and modes of writing a cookbook are amazing, and they're all equal. But it just depends on where you're at in your journey, in your career, how much time you can dedicate to that project, and where you want to see that project land. If it's in a more traditional sense of bookstores or in media, then going with traditional publishing is much, much easier than, say, self-publishing where everything falls on you. So yes, there's money to be had, and there's also ways to create income off of that book too. That's outside the publishers. You can also arrange for sponsorships. Say you used a brand of dishware frequently in your shoots, you can certainly approach that brand and say, "Hey, I love your china. Look what I did with it. Would you like to sponsor? Would you like to sell my cookbook?" So there's avenues that are really, it's the sky's the limit. It's all in how you can create them.
Hmm. What a wonderful idea. Like collaborations and just elevating even the quality of the work that you're producing in the cookbook, just through those collaborations. And then in the end, everybody wins. I love that
Exactly.
idea. I love that idea. So tell us, how many recipes does your cookbook have? How elaborate is that?
Over 100. Over 100. And
Oh,
yes, yes, ma'am. And I will say that I think 98% of those recipes, they each have their own individual picture, at least one
yeah.
hero shot. So
Oh,
for the
wow.
photographers that are listening, I'm sure they're starting to sweat bullets because
Yeah.
traditionally you would not include that many photographs in a cookbook. But because we created all of this content in-house, we were able to really pay a lot of attention to it, and we worked on our own time in a sense. We didn't have to hire out. There's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of, budgeting that goes into writing a cookbook if you don't shoot your own photographs and you hire
Hmm.
a photographer. And it's always good to realize that it's not just the recipes. It's not just the writing of the book. And it's not just the photographs. It's the combination of everything coming together and prioritizing what you do well and enjoy, and what perhaps you can farm out and let someone else show their skills. And we here at my business, we just happened to like doing all of it. So we did.
Oh, wow. And I feel like that's so relevant for today's times. You see, everybody's gone digital and everybody
Mhm.
has like the attention span is so little. So having a high visual appeal in a book or having something that keeps someone in that book is so important. People value it. People sometimes even buy books only for the photos.
That
I
would be
know.
me.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Me too. And my mom used to do that. So I
Mhm.
know that in today's world, when people are browsing bookstores, they're always thinking about, oh, but maybe I can find that online. Oh, maybe, I can just look it up.
Mhm.
But when there is a picture that hooks you and grips you and intrigues you, and you want to open that book and then you want to buy it, I think that's where the role of the photo comes in. So I would 100%, be all in support of you spending all the time and effort in creating those, elaborate visuals. I think it's so much necessary in the world that we live today. But also you mentioned that it's been a work in progress for almost 10 years. Like it's from a dream to a thought to, getting the concept and process and putting everything in place. Like I don't want people to feel overwhelmed that it takes 10 years to do something like that. But also, I would love for you to share with us how someone can actually get really clear on creating a concept for their cookbook. Like you said, that there was so much that you
Mhm.
did in house. There were so many little pieces and parts that you had to put together and think about them even before you got working. So, can you just like share how our creatives can actually create a clear concept before they get working on their cookbook?
Absolutely. And that your thought about the 10-year work process, that just resonated with me. I want to make a point. Um, I always save some recipes in my back pocket. I've been blogging for about 12 years now, and there
Mm-hmm.
are recipes that I never even put out there because I knew someday I'd want them in a book.
Wow.
So that's my tip for people. So if you're
Yes.
like me, where it's slow going, save some of those recipes. Don't release them. Let them be exclusive to your book, because most of the advice out there is that about 10% of the content can be recycled and the rest has to be new. It depends on the publisher. We
Mm.
have a couple of other recycled or reshot recipes, but that's my trick.
Mm.
So to get back to the question, so to narrow down the process, I think if we're already in this space, hopefully we've come to that moment of understanding our content pillars. And this is something that we've spoken about, all of us as a group, as a creator community. What are you? What are you making? Who is your audience? These are the things that you want to identify in any mode of content creation so that you find your target audience. So for me, it's always been about from scratch cooking, my aesthetic of light and bright with a floral touch, and home entertaining. And I had to figure out, how am I going to really weave these three very different aspects? They complement each other, but they're not necessarily partners in a book, because a lot of times there's single focus books. You're either making desserts, or you're throwing, something that might be themed, where you're discovering a new culture's food, or you're going through the process of maybe a beginner home cookbook. But how do you, really mash those three subjects that, for me, I'm very passionate about? So for several years, I was thinking about this just in the back of my mind. How would I do this? How would I figure this thing out? And what I did is I sat down and I took my good old notebook and a
Mm-hmm.
pen and decided, what do I want to convey? That's the very first thing. What do I want to do? Do I want to teach? Do I want to make a coffee table book? Do I want to just have sort of a conversation with myself and print this thing so my family has it? Where do I want this book to go, and who am I speaking to? And so for
Mm.
me, it was always the home cook, the budding home entertainer, or it could be even the more advanced cook and home entertainer who's looking for new tricks. So I sort of started circling on this idea of modern home entertaining. And with that came modern cooking techniques, how to streamline. So I found my
Mm.
content pillars. Then I wove it with my food POV, which again is that light and bright, from scratch cooking. And for this book, seasonal entertaining and seasonal cooking. So once I had that concept in mind, I started to build. And traditionally, if you have an idea and you've settled on that idea, you would write a pitch. A pitch is pretty much your 30-second elevator pitch, quite literally.
Mm-hmm.
What is your book about? Again, who you're talking to. It's the broad strokes. What do you want to convey? Your background. You would sketch out a table of contents, maybe give a couple of chapters as a sample, and then you would then talk to a cookbook agent, and they would take that pitch and start selling it, pitching it towards publishers. In my circumstance, as I mentioned earlier, the publisher had approached me with a rough idea that we completely changed after I gave my pitch. And then once you find an acceptable publisher, you move on to the proposal. Now, the proposal is a blueprint, and it helps you narrow down your focus again. So you're going from this kind of vast imaginative space where anything could happen to, okay, I have sort of my content pillars. What do I want to say? Who am I speaking to? Down to the pitch. And it keeps funneling downwards until suddenly you have this golden idea and the book is born. It may be rough, but it's there. So that proposal includes everything that's in the pitch, and you're going to add the title, a working title. You'll
Mm-hmm.
add the table of contents, the general painting of the concept, your bio, why you should be writing this book and why people should be listening to you, as well as the sort of marketing plans that happen too. And don't stress if this sounds overwhelming, which it did to me in the beginning. It's not. It sounds much more complicated than it is, but once you start writing it, especially if you have the help of a cookbook agent or someone at your publishing house to kind of help you formulate the document, it goes by, I think we wrote it in a day.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it's, oh, not the book,
Yeah, of course.
the pitch and the proposal. Ooh, I'm not that
Nice.
talented.
No.
But that's what it is you're
Yeah.
creating a blueprint to follow, and that blueprint becomes your basis, your planning structure to move forward into the writing, the recipe testing, and the shooting.
Mm-hmm. And this resonates so much with me because I am always advocate of being very intentional. Whether it's taking a picture for social media or, doing every little thing has to stem out of what's your intention out of it. And you said
Mhm.
exactly that, before you even came to, oh, what's my visual style or what's the food that I'm going to put in the cookbook? Your first question to yourself was, what's the intention with this cookbook? What do I really want it to do?
Mhm.
What's the purpose that it should serve? And I think that's the most important starting point. And I think it probably took you one day or less than a day to write your pitch and proposal because you were so clear on your intention. You were so clear
Mhm.
on what the purpose was, and that clarity is everything. If you have that established right in the beginning, I guess it just made everything so much easier for you because that thought process was already in place. You know exactly what you want to pitch, what's the purpose. That's what we want to put across. You talked about streamlining, right?
Mhm.
And I'm sure that, there's so many bits and pieces to it. Was there, and I also know that you you took help of your little diary and your your notebook and your pen. But were there any, there you go, I see it. Were there any, like, once you started thinking that, okay, now this is going to get real and I need to graduate from the notebook, it's time to, maybe use some applications. Were there any applications that you had to go and learn new programs, or what were some of the applications basically that you used to structure and start creating the content of the cook?
What I found really is this is such an excellent question too, because streamlining, I mean, if I could, I'd probably tattoo it on my forehead, because I'm a jack of all trades. I wear all the hats in my business, in my life, in addition to being this sort of content creator, I'm also a mother. I'm also, a volunteer, a member of the community, and time is precious. And also for your mental clarity, having that streamline is so important so that you don't lose the thread and become discouraged. So for me, it was less applications, and it might be generational. I'm a little bit older. I'm what do they call us? An elder millennial. There we go. So for me, if I'm not going to use my handy dandy notebook and pen, I just jump on a Word document. Like, I'm really simple. I found that for me, it was about mapping. And to get a grip on the content, I physically had to map it. Now, there are ways to do this. Some people like to use Pinterest, surprisingly. They will collect images and mark each folder as a chapter for it becomes a visual guide. Some people like to actually get hands-on and make collages as a visual guide. I think that you could use any of the sort of online applications for sorting, or you could use a Slack channel for yourself. You could, where you're subcategorizing it. I tried doing that, and I found I kept returning back to just a plain old Word doc, because I could see it, I could save it, I could also share it, which was very important to me, because as I started working with an editor, I wanted her to see my progress. I wanted her to see my thought pattern, because that's a relationship that is terribly important, even from the first steps. It's not just the finished product. It's sort of like showing your work when you're doing geometry. You want to show each step. And that's what it became for me, is showing each step from my mind, so I could go back and say, oh, you know what, that didn't really work, or that recipe writing is not as clear as it could be. And it was very easy to show my editor the same thing, and she could go back with her red pen and tell me, hey, this is not, let's switch this. So for me, I'm old school, notebooks or Word docs, but whatever mode you feel most comfortable in and that you can stick to. And that's really important, because we talk about this a lot in content creation in regards to posting and creating and all of that jazz. Find a schedule that you can stick to. When you're writing, you have to not only find a schedule that you can stick to, but a pattern, a habit. It becomes a habit, like exercising in the morning or eating well, or we were discussing, coffee or tea in the morning. Like, what is your habit? And for me, it was that Word doc.
And I think you touched on such an important thing, and that is this discipline that it takes to actually write a cookbook. I mean, we know that we want our audience to feel that it's a joyful process, but it's also a process that needs your dedication and your hard work. Like, the whole point of finding that slot every morning or a time in the day where you dedicatedly do this every single day, show up and work on your cookbook. I love that. Also, I'm a person who toggles between my notebook and the Word document and an iPad. So I think it's so important that we find our tools, what works for us. Number one, I love that you said that create a framework. So basically list down everything so that all the parts that go into it, and whether it's you reviewing it or someone else reviewing it, that you've not missed a step. It's all lined up in front of you. So usually I would write it down in a notebook, and then I would transfer it to a Word document and start elaborating it. And then suddenly I'll have a brainwave and I'll be like, no, now I need to turn this into something visual. So I'll create a flowchart. And that flowchart will have even more information about, oh, this involves this process, but if this doesn't happen, then I can do that. And it becomes this. So I would usually, I've not written a cookbook, but whenever I'm creating something, I toggle between 3 different mediums. And so whether we choose 1 or 3, it really depends on our process. And one thing that I really took away from what you said was simplify. Keep it simple, keep it what relates to you so that you can continue to do it without feeling like, oh, this doesn't resonate or this doesn't relate to the way I work. I love that. I know that, as much as we need to show up to write our recipes and do all the writing in a dedicated way, the real work is in creating and testing the recipes. Oh my God. That is like hours and hours and days of, weeks of testing. Tell me, what's the best way to go about it? And was there a process for that worked for you, like batching? Or did you do, did you test and then write the recipe, photograph it and have it ready? Or did you like test a couple of recipes and then did all the batching for the photography and the writing? How did it work for you?
That was the most fascinating part, I think. And it was a real lesson because when I blog, I would typically section off one weekend a month where I would first shoot everything that I had created the month before. So I'd have it out there and then I could work on writing about it. And then somewhere along the lines, I'd start the new recipe testing. For the book, because we had a very short amount of time to actually develop the content, shoot the content, edit the content, I would say was only 6 or 7 months that we ended up having to do all this because we are also, and I did this project alongside my business partner, who happens to be my husband as well. We are natural light photographers. So we don't mess around with artificial light. So again, you're creating structure. You only have so much light. The best light for us is in the spring and the summer. So we realized very quickly we had to be very, very concrete and intentional with our scheduling. So before I go into my individual ways of doing this, I will say, and I don't want people to fear this, outsource. If you feel like you need help with the recipe testing, find someone to help you do it. Outsource it. If you need someone to come in and help you be a second photographer, grab that second. Or if you want someone to help you with styling, you don't have to do it all. There are so many talented people out there who are ready to help you so that you can focus on what you want to focus on and what you do best. I happen to be a glutton for punishment. So we did it all. What I did was I took about 2 months to really think about what recipes and what sort of menu ideas I wanted to create, what story I was creating. So the book is really separated into 4 seasons, and we created 4 different event or holiday menus per season. So we're talking 16 tablescapes, many, many recipes from drinks to desserts, subcategories of dressings and sauces and cocktail syrups and all that sort of things, plus edible flower guides, home entertaining tips, how to design, rules of 3, how to photo. I mean, it's all in there. It's pretty much your party planner in a book. But when it came to recipe development, I focused on the seasons. I focused on what was typically available, as well as alternatives depending on where you were in the world. Because if it's Christmas time where I am in North America and I can only get citrus, that's completely different in the Southern Hemisphere where everything is going bonkers crazy and it's amazing. And, flipping it around, summer for me is winter. So what I did was I would develop during the week. Each recipe was tested at least half a dozen times. I am a full believer that recipes need to be repeatable. If the home cook is going to invest in my book, I want to give them the greatest chance of success. And, from having outsourced some of the testing, everyone came away with being able to replicate these recipes. And not only that, we had to also, because we don't work in metric, I had to convert everything to metric as well, so that it was imperial. There we go.
Yeah.
We work in imperial. I had to switch to metric and have both on there. So that was a whole other thing. Yeah. Recipe testing took about a month and a half. And I was methodical. I, again, had my notebook, wrote down things as I went, changed, tweaked. I made it a little bit easier on myself because I had established recipes already in my repertoire that I sort of played off of. So if I was making, say, a pavlova, I have a recipe for a cherry pavlova with, chocolate shavings and cream. I would take that recipe and say, oh, you know what? I'm going to switch this for a stone fruit pavlova. Let's make the peaches into a stewed cinnamon peach, and we'll add a cinnamon whipped cream, and maybe we'll add, toasted pecans on top. So the framework is the same, but the flavors are completely different. And then I focused on showstopper recipes. those recipes that would make or break that dinner or luncheon or brunch. And those were ones I really heavily invested on creating from scratch, new, bold flavors that were still accessible to every home cook. So it's deciding where you want to put the most energy in as well to create a comprehensive menu. After the recipes were tested and written down, we then would take, I think we took two,
So you
two
batched
2 week
them.
blocks.
You did
We
batch.
batched them
Yeah.
and we just went,
Yeah. Yeah.
did 3 or 4 recipes a day. And our neighbors loved us because we provided lunch and dinner for everybody. And and that was it. So I
Hmm.
like to batch my recipe testing. I like to batch the writing. I like to batch the photography. That way I
Mm.
have it cleared off. I think, again, simplicity is best. And understanding that the other thing I think that we don't often expect is that we're also footing the bill for
Mm,
all the food
exactly.
costs.
Yeah.
So if I was going to do a bunch of cherry recipes, you bet your beans, I was going to use those cherries as often as I could in the recipes or in the food photography. Same with flowers, because there's a very heavy element of flowers in my shoots.
Yep.
If I'm going to go to the flower store and grab $500 worth of flowers, we are making a lot of tablescapes
Yes.
that
Yes.
weekend. So yeah, it's about budgeting your time as well as your
Yeah.
money
I
too.
I have to ask. So if you're recipe testing and you spend so much money on getting the ingredients and you have all the ingredients right there, I'm sure you're using some of them in the styling and the photography as well. So when you're batching the testing and then you're doing the photo shoot at a later date, you are going back and, spending all the money, buying all those ingredients again. So how does that play out? Does that still work well?
It does. I think, obviously when I'm in recipe development, I'm using less, generally
Mm,
speaking, of those ingredients. I'm tweaking. I'm making small tweaks. Usually when I recipe develop, I don't want to jinx myself, but I'm not that far away from the finished product I want. So I don't
mm-hmm,
have to spend a lot of money. I just have to buy enough to make 2 batches of
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
something, and I tweak everything individually, and I cut down on the recipe too. So if I'm making, let's go back to the cherries. If I'm
Yes.
making a cherry bourbon sauce, instead of making what I would consider the full batch for the recipe, let's say 2 cups, I'm instead going to cut it down
Yeah,
to a
yeah.
quarter
Good point.
so
Yes.
that I can make different. And then, maybe that quarter came out almost where I want it, and I'm going to tweak it by adding just a little bit more bourbon over here, or I'm going to add a little more cinnamon over here to get to where I want. So it's about being smart and not wasteful with your
Mm-hmm.
ingredients and utilizing
Yeah.
what you have
And
as much
also,
as you can during that moment.
I feel like you have to kind of prepare the food a little bit differently for the camera. So photo shoot and preparing your food will be a bit different from how you would eat it, cook it, and is sometimes even
Oh, yeah.
presented. Right. So yeah, so the proportions and things that you need will probably be different. And you work with a lot of fresh ingredients like
Mhm.
fruits and flowers, and they are so time sensitive, right? They
Correct.
wither and you really have to keep them fresh. And so were there any like specific, like your top food styling tips, especially when we are shooting for cookbooks, maybe something that you might have discovered, oh, for printing, this kind of food styling works better, or these colors work better, or maybe, when you're shooting in natural light, if you capture da 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 da, it looks better. So are there any food styling tips that you discovered along the way that work really well for cookbooks?
This could be a class unto itself. So this was a deep dive for us. We learned as we went. What I would say is remember, for us, our photographs ended up using negative space as
Mm,
part of the styling, but
love it.
also as part of the layout. So if you're going to have a recipe and the recipe text is intended to overlay on top of a food photograph, you can't have a super busy food photograph. You can't throw every plate in there, every sauce, every, fun item. You actually have to leave space for the text. You have to leave space for the eye to rest. So when we're working with branded content, typically we're getting at least a draft idea from the brand of what they want. When it's you have to have a very clear vision of what you want your photographs to look like, the styling, the intention. Again, are you going to shoot with artificial light? Is it going to be dark and moody? Is it going to be light and bright? Are you going to create a feeling of abundance, or are you going to go for minimalism? All of
Mm-hmm.
that should happen very similar to before you pick up the camera for any other content. Have a plan, know what you're doing, and also have your photo guide, your shot list ready
Right.
too, because you don't want to waste a lot of time, as you mentioned, if you're working with a lot of fresh ingredients, they die. They're toast. So you don't have time to kind of mess around. So for food styling, for me, I think it goes back to my ethos in my traditional work too. Something fresh, something colorful, creating texture. I think it's really important that you realize people, most of the time, will buy a cookbook for the photos. If your photos stand out, they will buy that book. They may never make a recipe from that book, but they will flip through it and they will buy it. So
it might become a coffee table
really,
book. Yeah. There you
I
go.
hope mine does.
Yeah.
Like that's how I kind of pitched it. You want to understand your buyer, which goes back to that pitch and proposal stage too. Like who is your person? Who is your market? So when I was creating the styling, I knew I wanted it to feel magical. I wanted it to feel like you stepped into a garden. That was a big sort of stylistic tip was we are working from the garden. We're working with the seasons. We're working to bring the natural sort of world into these photographs, but at the same time, it's still in your dining room. So how are we going to mesh that? You don't have to break the bank either with your props. We used, I think, a total of 6 sets of dishes for everything. You're going to see a lot of repeats.
Yeah.
You can borrow from people.
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to go and buy the whole store. You don't have to do that. Borrow from people. My entire Christmas setup, borrowed. I'll tell you here on this podcast, there's an Easter egg in there. There's the name of my dear friend who gave me all of the Christmas items. It's on a name tag. She has a little Easter egg in there. But remember your negative space would be my biggest point in that lighting is very important to your story. So for us, light and bright is great, but sometimes it doesn't transition well into printing. So you may have to bring it down a bit.
Yes.
Dark and moody, same idea. Dark and moody is gorgeous, but sometimes you get a lot of noise when it goes to the page. So it's really understanding and asking questions to your editor. What is going to work best for your printing process?
And did you have the layouts already decided? Like where would the text be? Where would the photo be? Because that's how you can kind of visualize, where's the negative space? Is it on the left, right, bottom, top? Did you have the layouts done before?
No, that was a very strong no. We did and we didn't. It was a beautiful partnership between us, the editor, and the design team at the publisher. So we knew that we should keep from looking at, so you do a lot of market research, right? You're going to go to the closest bookstore and you're going to flip through what is popular right now. This is part of your proposal too, is seeing what is available, what could complement your work, what style is really resonating with audiences, what is on that top shelf right now, not behind and gathering dust. That's going to inform you a bit of what needs to happen. But we wanted to use negative space. We realized from looking at other cookbooks that negative space was quite important. So we incorporated that very quickly. We had made a sample chapter or two to give to the publisher fairly early on in the process, just so we had something to show them. And it ended up being a real template for the designer. She took my very rough idea from Canva that I had just kind of whipped up and turned it into something that was polished. It was like, I had a piece of coal. She turned it into a diamond. You could see the ancestry of the idea. So the layouts were a conversation, most definitely, between all of us and the designer. But it's different for each publishing house. And I would dare say it's probably different for each sort of editor team, too. So that's a great question to ask once you've been signed. What is this going to look like? How much input do I have? Because everybody is different. We had a lot of input. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's more the publishing house has the final say on which photos are going to be used, what style is going to be used, and on the layout. This was very conversational, very equal.
I want to get into that a little bit later. We definitely want to understand how did you even get an editor and, all of that. But I want to go back into the photography part that we spoke about. And I thought that everything you brought up, it was so interesting because right here, we are talking about what you learned as part of your process of writing the cookbook, photographing the cookbook. But I think the points that you mentioned are such important takeaways for someone who is going to become a photographer for a cookbook as well. Someone who will photograph for someone else. And just the idea of asking them, do you need negative space? And, just asking all the important questions. Do you have a layout? Is that it's something like we photographers, we usually have this approach when we are shooting for packaging, food packaging,
Hmm.
so where the text goes and where the photo goes, it's important. And I'm guessing that's what your next step was in really laying out the pages and seeing those overlaps. Tell me one thing. I think, Jessie, you mentioned that you were in this with your business partner, your husband.
Yes.
Very, very fun and cool. I think so. Some folks may not
Yeah.
agree with that. you know,
No, it's a
um,
joy.
it's a joy. Okay, good to hear that. And how did that work? Like, I'm sure having someone right beside you, I'm sure you both were so in sync pretty much when you had to do the photography. But when you hire a photographer, you have a third person, you really have to work quite hard in that communication and getting that
Hmm.
idea across, right? So tell me a little bit about your experience of working with your husband and creating these photos together versus if you would have hired another photographer, some pros and cons
Hmm.
of either.
Hmm. Absolutely. So my husband is just like me. We're self-taught in this industry because it's our passion. So he's a self-taught photographer, and we've worked together from the very beginning. And we have very complementary sort of ideas. He has a terrific eye for framing. I have to give that to him. It's quite stunning. I will tell him an idea, a visual. I am a former professional ballet dancer, a theater kid. So
Mm-hmm.
I think very theatrically, I guess you could say, sort of like each scene is a piece of theater. You're on stage. And he is able to take what I say and with my styling in his eye and create something that's very distinctive. If you were to look at that page, you know it's us. If you were to find us
Mm-hmm.
online, you know that's my business. It's Straight to the Hips Baby or Jessie Ross and Jonathan Ross. So to work with him, it pushed me and I pushed him. Now it is not to say that we didn't disagree. In fact, there are several times where we
Yeah.
did disagree. And my feeling is, well, we'll do it both ways and see what looks best. You have to figure out how to work together to get what you need, first of all, but also to complement each other because you're two creatives. One is not higher in opinion than the other. If you're going to do this together, you're going to do this together. So the only con that we ran into was time. So
Mm-hmm.
we both work. He is a full-time physician,
Oh,
also. So it's a very demanding job. This is his vacation. He loves
right.
doing this as a relief.
Wow.
Um, and it's finding the time and the space. Every shot was done in our home, so we didn't outsource to a studio. This was done in my dining room.
Mm,
And occasionally we employed my eldest son, who's 14, to come over and hold the diffuser screen.
nice.
Don't worry, we paid him. You know, the benefit of doing it in-house with someone that you know is it's a time saver. You have your own shorthand. You don't have to spend a lot of time negotiating and figuring it out. We did sit down together typically before every shoot to go over that shot list, to discuss sort of lighting and angling, keeping in mind what we wanted in regards to the book format, what the publisher was sort of thinking, as well as checking in with our color story, because we are working within the 4 seasons. And I wanted to make sure there was a distinct color story going throughout. So we had individual palettes to work from, but it was very seamless and it was very easy. Now, if you're someone who is not as comfortable with the food photography, don't feel that you have to do this. If you were to hire out, you would have these same conversations. It would
Mm-hmm.
be very much like how we deal with a brand. You would sit down, you would either talk to several photographers, or if you work with a photographer generally, you would sit down and have that conversation. What are we doing? What's the plan? What's the lighting technique? Who's doing the styling? What is the story that we are trying to tell with those styling elements as well? And is there room for bonus shots? Is there room for creating that human element? Because oftentimes in cookbook photography, we're focusing on the hero shot, the finished dish. And if you look at a lot of cookbooks, we're seeing a lot of overhead, right?
Mm-hmm.
Overhead
Mm-hmm.
flat
Mm-hmm.
lays. My book, I do a lot of 3/4 shots because I want the person to feel like when you're a small child and you get up close to that piece of cake and you
Mm.
want to dive in. That's my format. I want that, but have that intention before you go in. But make sure that you and that photographer really understand what's happening, and it's worth the conversation, and it's worth laying the groundwork too. Again, respect. You have the utmost respect for that photographer, and that photographer in turn will have the utmost respect for you. So when you say, hey, pause, let's reset, this is not going where I want it to go, it's a nice, smooth transition.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the negatives with hiring an outside photographer is that it will cut into your budget.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of times the publisher will give you an advance, and it depends on the size of the publishing house, what sort of forecast they have for sales, what the size of that advance is. A lot of times that advance money will go into the photography, and that's one of the reasons there aren't as many photographs in cookbooks as
Mm-hmm.
most authors would like to see, because it is expensive. So I would say
Mm-hmm.
that is the negative, but we know on the flip side, if we're food photographers, we are worth our services. We are worth the
Mm-hmm.
pay. So
Yeah.
find how much you can spend for the highest quality product that you can have.
Right. I love this, Jessie. I think these are so valid for anyone who is shooting their own cookbook, hiring a photographer, or becoming a photographer for a cookbook, that's coming up. I love these. But I want to now step into the more complicated part or so as it is in my head. But I want your help here, and I want you to oversimplify this for us. All right. So I
Mhm.
know that at several points you've mentioned how during the photography process, there was the involvement of the editor or the past discussion with the publisher, and you had to follow the guidelines. So all these discussions had already happened, and the parameters were laid out even before you started the photography. So I want your help to kind of step back and walk us through what is the point at which these actors start playing their role in the cookbook movie process. All right. So walk us through the process of writing a cookbook, but in like literally how you would list down so that we're not overwhelmed out of it. And then we can understand, oh, at this point, an editor comes on board. At this point, a publisher, we've had this discussion. So in your easiest and simplest way. So that was part one of our conversation with Jessie. And I hope that some of your big takeaways were really that, the biggest value of writing a cookbook is the emotional value or the dream value in it versus a monetary value. A cookbook is born out of real passion and dream for creating something that is bigger and meant for the long run. A cookbook is never for the short term. All right. So I hope that was a big takeaway for you. And for me, the other one was that it all starts with being highly, highly intentional and clear about what you want to do. And then you go and communicate it to the publisher, the editor, and everything else then becomes the snowball effect. But it begins with having that utmost clarity and intention. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you had a lot of learnings, because part two is going to get into a lot of interesting stuff. We are going to get into the process and the editor and the digital designer and the publishing houses and the costs that are involved. It's going to be juicy, and juicy like you would want it to be. All right. With that, I'll see you next week with another episode. If you have any questions in the meantime, send me an email on hello@myfoodlens.com or DM me on Instagram at Gyutama_myfoodlens. I'll see you next week with another episode. Until then, bye-bye.